In this segment, we'll cover the basic settings you need to get recording quickly with the Zoom F8 and F8n. The F8 and the F8n are incredibly deep products. There is so much to talk about, but we're just going to talk about the basic settings, and we'll cover a lot of the other settings and options in future segments. So first we're going to come into the input menu, and let's just run through the most critical things. First of all, input source. You do need to choose what is coming into each input. So is it going to be a microphone or a line level signal? Microphone, of course, is going to be any type of condenser microphone or dynamic microphone on an XLR cable. Line is going to be any other sort of audio equipment. So for example, a mixer would be something you might choose a line level for. In our case, we're going to record with two microphones on inputs 1 and 2, and we're going to set those both to mic. Now, we're not doing any sort of ambisonic recording. That's a completely separate topic and far beyond the scope of what we can cover here. High-pass filter, I usually do turn the high-pass filter on to 60 Hertz. The idea here is that when you're recording dialogue, in particular, this is going to reduce any sort of low-frequency rumble. Now, it's important to remember that human dialogue doesn't generally register in this low-frequency range, so this will only make for a cleaner recording. And it's optional. You don't have to do it. Typically, I will do it either on the microphone if the microphone has a mild high-pass filter like this, and a lot of times the microphone will have a much more aggressive high-pass filter that's generally going to be more useful for things where you're recording out in a very windy situation and whatever wind protection you brought for your microphone isn't sufficient for the level of wind that's coming in. So this is usually going to be something I'll do on the recorder, or you can do it in post as well. Next up is input limiter. Now, this is a little bit more of a complicated decision here. If you turn it on the F8 or the F8n, the noise floor automatically raises 10 decibels. Now, that's not a huge issue since, again, the preamps on the F8 and the F8n are very clean, but it does raise the noise floor because of the way it works. Usually, I'll only turn this on if I'm not sure exactly how loud things are going to get. For example, with an unscripted type of piece, or if I know I'm shooting something, and I've heard people cite this before, I don't usually shoot this kind of thing, but if you're shooting a horror narrative show, you might get whispers to screams, and in that case, you might really want the limiter. Now, when I do use the limiter, I'm almost always using the advanced limiter, so I'll turn that on. The only other setting I have to choose is the target level, and I normally will set that about -2 dB full scale. What this setting does in particular is the max level that the limiter will allow the sound to come through at after the sound passes through the limiter. All this is doing is giving me 2 decibels of headroom, so I'm just making sure that we keep well away from the 0 dB clipping point, and usually that works pretty nicely. You'll notice I'm skipping some of these because they're not as critical for just kind of a basic getting up and running. Phantom power you will need to choose, and you can choose it by input. So for example, on input 1, I know that I'm going to have a boom microphone that requires phantom power, so I'll turn that on. I can also change the voltage. Most phantom powered microphones will require 48 volts, but if you happen to have one that can work with 24 volts, you can do that and save yourself a little bit of battery. You can also turn on this power saving mode. All that does is that when you go to play back a track, it will turn off the phantom power while you're playing back the track. So it'll save you a little bit of battery there. Next up, we're going to pop back out and go into the rec menu. So in the rec menu, for example, you get to choose what gets recorded to the SD card 1 and SD card 2. The nice thing again about the F8 and the F8n is it has 2 SD cards, and you can record the same thing to both cards or different things to each card. So let's just run through each of the options here. If for some reason you didn't want to record anything to one of the SD cards, you could choose none. Normally I will choose this track 1 through 8 polywave. What that will do is it will record each of the individual inputs that I have enabled into a single wave file, and they'll each be on their own channel. So that is a good way to keep everything separate so that in post you can do mixing. If, on the other hand, you wanted to record each of the channels or each of the stereo pairs to a separate file, you would choose this next setting here, track 1 through 8 mono stereo wave. So that's going to create multiple files for each input or stereo linked pair. So for example, if I were recording 3 microphones on inputs 1, 2, and 3, and I choose this option here, what that means is when I press record, I'm actually going to get 3 different files. I'm going to get 3 wave files, one for input 1, one for input 2, and one for input 3. Now the next option here is track 1 through 8 plus LR. So this is the same as the very first option. It's going to record everything into a single poly wave file, each on its own channel, but it will also record a left and right mix of all of the individual inputs that have been mixed together. and it will do that on a left and right channel. So it'll be a stereo mix. And the reason this is useful is a lot of times in narrative film work, we use this if there's going to be a significant post-processing workflow where somebody will do the editing and then somebody else will actually come in and do a more careful job in mixing the audio. The left and right mix will be used by the editing team to do the edit of the video itself, and then the individual ISO tracks will be used by the post-audio team to do a really kind of fine-tuned mix and really dial things in. The next option is the exact same, except that it's breaking each of the mono or stereo-linked inputs into their own files. We could also just record a stereo mix if we wanted to do that. That'll just be a stereo file with a left and right channel, mix of all of the different microphone inputs. You will not get the isolated channels, the isolated microphone inputs recorded on that case, so be careful. That's not necessarily something you want. But if you do want something very simple and straightforward, that is an option as well. And then if you do want to record to MP3 for some reason, you can only do that to a left and right mix. In our case, I just want the isolated channels in a single poly wave file. The exact same settings refer to SD card number 2. So this is where you can choose and record something different to SD card 2, or record the exact same thing and it will serve as a backup for you. Sample rate for dialogue, I almost always set to 48 kilohertz for film and video projects. That's pretty much a standard. However, if you are recording something like sound effects, sometimes I will record that at 96 kilohertz. And the reason I do that is that if I'm going to do any sort of significant processing to them, for example, slowing them down, I might want those extra samples so that I still have all that sampling there when I slow them down to halftime, for example. Now you can actually go up to 192 kilohertz if you have some of the other features turned off. For example, right now, because we have the advanced hybrid limiter turned on, 192 kilohertz is not available to us. So you can do that if you turn features like the advanced hybrid limiter off. Again, mostly for dialogue, I'm going to record at 48 kilohertz. For wave bit depth, you get two options, 16-bit or 24-bit. In the professional world, we're almost always using 24-bit. If, for example, you want to save on file space, you can go to 16-bit, or if for whatever reason your project requires a lower bit depth, you can go with 16-bit. I almost always go with 24. If you are recording to MP3, you get three options in terms of the bit rate. That's a little bit different than bit depth. Don't confuse the two. But for the highest quality, you want to go to 320 kbps. You can go to 192 or 128 if you prefer, for, again, smaller files. Dual channel recording. Now, if you want to use dual channel recording, this can actually solve a problem very similar to what a limiter can do. But instead, what you do is you record one microphone input to two separate tracks at two separate gain trim levels. So what this does for you is if you have a microphone coming in, for example, into input number 1, and I turn this dual recording on, you can see now that now inputs 1 and 5 are on. Before it was just 1. So what that means is it's going to record that individual microphone coming into input 1 to both track 1 and track 5. And if I come back out, you'll see they're both enabled here. That's what the red box means. And I can set the fader level and the gain level to two separate things. So for example, here on the main input, I have it set to 40 decibels of gain. And then over here on the secondary one, I would probably set that to maybe somewhere around 30 decibels of gain. So what that means in practical terms is that the exact same thing will get recorded to both tracks, but on this secondary track, it will record 10 decibels lower than on the primary track. If the talent gets really, really loud, louder than I expected, and the primary track clips, in post, I can come back in to this secondary track and cut in that one part where the clipping occurred to save that audio so that it sounds good without having any sort of clipping or distortion. So that's how dual channel works. Again, that's going to be in the rec menu, and I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. In this case, I'm not going to use that. The nice thing about dual channel record is that you don't raise the noise floor by using it automatically like you do with a limiter here in the F8 and the F8n. However, it does take more work in post to cut that in if you need to just cut in the portions that got clipped. So it's kind of a trade-off, but it's a nice thing to have. There's also this pre-record option. The idea with a pre-record is that when you have it turned on, when I go to press the record button, the recording will actually have the 6 seconds prior to the time I press the record button. That's a pretty cool feature. And the reason that's really useful is if you're late getting to the record button while you're working on set, you will get the previous 6 seconds. Now, that time actually varies depending on some of the other settings you've used. So, for example, if you have the sample rate set to 48 kilohertz or lower, you can get up to 6 seconds recorded before you press the record button. If you go to a higher sample rate, that bumps down to 3 seconds of record time that it records prior to you pressing the record button. Or if you go to 192 kilohertz, it only records 1 second prior to the time you press the record button. So it's kind of a cool feature. I usually leave it on. It's not a big deal because audio files are pretty small, so it's not a big cost to record that extra time, and that's saved me a couple of times as well. The last setting here is this file max size. Now, I would normally just leave this at 2 gigabytes. That's the max file size that this will record. If you bump up against that, what it will do is it will start a new file, and they will come together in post perfectly. You just put them right next to each other, and you won't miss a beat, and that works really nicely. 2 is the max. It's a limitation of the file system, as I understand it, so I would just leave that at max. Now, a lot of these settings can actually also be made in the PFL menu for each input. So for example, input 1 will come into the PFL menu. You'll notice a lot of these things are here. So you can set them here if that's easier for you. For example, input source, we've got trim level, that's the gain trim. We've got phantom, we can turn on and off. We've got our high pass filter set. We've got our input limiter. We can change the pan, phase invert. We can stereo link, so on and so forth. So right now that stereo link's turned off. So that is a convenience feature. So just something interesting to note. The nice thing about having all of that here, especially like the gain trim, is that it makes it so you're only hearing input number 1 in this case. And as you're setting that gain level, changing this here, you have the meter down here to show you where you're at. So that's really helpful when you're setting the gain. And we cover that in one of the other segments here. So that's a quick overview on how to do the most critical settings to get up and recording quickly with the Zoom F8 or the F8n.